I think we're slowly getting to the point where we're ready to get started. I hope you had a chance to enjoy lunch. Matthias Tobo and, yeah, they're not here, but our chief architect. Kirsty Bell, who's here, is a writer and a critic living in Berlin. She's the author of The Undercurrents, A Story of Berlin, which appeared on Fitzcarraldo editions in 2022, and The Artist's House, From Workplace to Artwork, Sternberg Press in 2013. And I think that will be the book that you will draw upon today also. Bell's art criticism has been published in Frieze, for which she was contributing editor from 2011 till 2021, as well as other art magazines and exhibition catalogs, including for MoMA, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Stedelijk, and Tate. She has taught and lectured regularly at art academies and institutions across Europe. Her next book is forthcoming with Fitzcarraldo editions in 2026, something that I'm personally looking forward to very much. And we just spoke about whether I also do a brief introduction to the talk. I think we agreed that maybe you'll do the talking and I'll do the listening. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Kirsty. The word is yours.
Thank you, Milan, for giving me the floor so spontaneously. And thank you, well, it's great to see so many people here, really fantastic to have such an interested audience. And yeah, so I have many kind of excuses that I'm going to begin with, just to give you a little bit of the context of what I'm going to talk about. Unlike many of the other speakers today, I'm not an expert in the work of Hanne Darboven. I've been fascinated in it since I first came across it, which was in the late 1990s at DIA in New York. I think it was 1996 when the whole Kulturgeschichte was being shown. But I have to admit that when I saw that, like as impressed and overwhelmed as I was by it, I was somewhat intimidated by this immersive scale and complexity. And, you know, just having a few short conversations with various other people today, I've kind of noticed that this sense of intimidation and being overwhelmed is quite a common response to Darboven's work. So even though I've always been absolutely intrigued by it, and I did write a short review of a show in 2009 in Berlin shortly after she died, I feel like I've always just kind of stayed on the edge of the pool, so to speak, like maybe dipped a toe in and never actually taken the plunge. So I have Milan to thank for kind of pushing me in, so to speak, by sending me a text in December and saying, have you ever been to Hanne Darboven's house? Which I hadn't, but I had heard a lot about it, and I'd always been curious about what this entity might be. So this presentation that I'm going to give today really is just an initial foray into Darboven's work. I feel like, for me, it's an engagement that's really just at the beginning stages. And as Milan suggested, I'm going to focus on the house itself. And, you know, just so everyone knows, I have actually only been there once. I went with Milan there, and Sam Lewitt, who's speaking later. We went together there in May. So, and anyone who's actually seen the house already will know that one visit is, you know, it's if you haven't seen it, it's hard to describe. If you've just been there once, then it's overwhelming. You know, you can't really figure out what it is you're looking at. So, but in this talk today, I want to try and figure out what it is we're looking at when we're in Hanne Darboven's house. Hopefully it will be the first interpretation. I'll get a chance to look at it deeper and, you know, go in deeper. So I'm going to lean quite heavily today on scholarship by other writers and art historians, and particularly Miriam Schoof, who has written very eloquently about the role of objects in Hanne Darboven's work. I also want to thank Esther Döring, who's not here today, who is working on the Hanne Darboven archive with Esther Schipper. She was the one who gave us this very knowledgeable and rich tour of the house in May. And some of the other sources that I've really leaned on that I would really recommend everybody to look at if they're able to, if they're interested. One is the extraordinary filmed interview from 1991, directed by Walter Schmerling, when Hanne Darboven is 51 years old. It's a really illuminating interview and just chance to get a sense of what her artistic persona was. And then also there's a new film that has just been completed by the artist Julia Geisbacher that has it was made posthumously. It has quite a different sensibility, but it also gives you a really interesting insight into this kind of cosmos of Hanne Darboven's house. So I'm not going to delve into the works themselves at great depth, but more think about this kind of what this phenomenal resource might be that she left behind when she passed away in 2009. What is this artist's house, this archive, this diary in three-dimensional form? And I'm going to do this partly through comparisons with other artists for whom the house, this domestic arena, was of great significance and closely related to their artistic practice. And in doing this, I'm going to draw on the research and material from the book that I published in 2013, The Artist's House from Workplace to Artwork. And that book looked at 20 different artists. It was essentially 20 case studies of artists dating back to the early 20th century, relatively subjective handful, I would say, but all artists for whom there was an essential and interesting intersection between the work itself and the house that they lived in. And you know, since that publication came out, like more than 10 years ago, and since then I have of course come across many other interesting houses of artists. But I have to say that this house is the one where I really regret not having been able to include it in the book, because there's just so much fascinating material. There's so many aspects. You know, it really is asking for a deep dive. So also, I'm not gonna, you know, in this looking into the house, this like intimate domestic area, I just want to say that I'm not intending through that to get a kind of biographically determined reading of the work, which I think particularly in Darboven's case would be a reductive reading, but rather I want to think about the conditions for the work's production, this specific intersection of place, time, and persona that can happen in the place where the work is made. Here, you know, it's right here, which is great to think about, you know, all of this incredible body of work made right here. We're really lucky, I think, to have this proximity. So just to give you a sense of what the structure is for my talk, I also have to say the picture quality is super erratic. It's not going to be as beautifully presented as Paula's. I also want to say that I'm very happy to kind of give this kind of wild galloping overview as a contrast to this very precise and fine and articulate and delicately put together close reading, like close analysis of this aspect of, you know, that Paula gave us. I think that's really, you know, kind of juicy to have that contrast. Anyway, so this is going to be a little bit more rough and ready, I think, with a lot of very bad photographs that I took on my iPhone when I was going around. Anyway, so what I want to think about I'm going to begin with thinking about the house itself. There's be some repetition with things we've already heard, and think about what about Hanne Darboven herself as an artistic persona, what that might be. And then I want to look at the house, how the house was used and how we might interpret it now as the workplace where Hanne Darboven's work was made, as a repository for these kind of extraneous elements of the work, as a Gesamtkunstwerk. Does it exist is it now a Gesamtkunstwerk, now that the artist is no longer with us, sorry? Or is it a diaristic entity? Does it kind of function as a diary of her life, a kind of calendar? Or is it perhaps an anchor? Can we see it as an anchor, as the kind of Gegenpol, you know, the other axis to her wide-ranging conceptual practice? So there is, of course, going to be some overlap between these different categories, but I've used them really as a means of orientation within this cosmos of Hanne Darboven's life and work. So that's how it's going to be, and I'm just going to dive in and see where we end up. So I'm going to begin with the house. So unlike the studio, which is a specific place, the artist's studio, a specific place dedicated to the production of work, a house is a non-specific context, full of extraneous contingency. The house is a boundary between the world at large and a private centre. It's a container for the everyday and an activated environment. Gaston Bachelard says, we write a room or read a house. And Marguerite Duras says of the home, it's here where the story of our lives takes place. So what does this mean for a writer like Hanne Darboven, who claimed, Ich schreibe Zimmer voll, I fill rooms with writing? So Rönneburg, where we are now, is in the district of Harburg. South of Hamburg is a quiet suburb surrounded by fields. Well-heeled, I think, also, you can tell. And in this villa that we're in right now, it was built in 1910 to 1912 and bought in 1935, along with the farmhouse next door, by Hanne Darboven's father, César Darboven. So Hanne Darboven apparently was not born here, which I just learnt, but lived here essentially as a small child. She was born in 1941. She lived here with her father, her mother, her older sister, eventually her younger sister, and the family owned this villa, lived in this villa until it was sold in 1945. My dates might be a little bit off, just so everyone knows, but more or less there. The house was sold after a fire in the company premises and the need to raise funds for the repair of what may have been a coffee roasting premises, but I've also heard that it was a Kaffee Ersatz factory, which makes sense given the wartime, like a coffee substitute production. This house was sold and the family moved into the farmhouse next door, 16th century, 15th century, very old. 1497. Okay, so just 15th century. And also just to put this time in a little bit of a broader context, there's an essay by W.G. Sebald from 2002 called The Natural History of Destruction. In this essay, he writes about the Allied bombing campaigns at the end of the Second World War, during the Second World War, and the effect that they had on the German residential population. And he you know, as the basis of his essay, he's writing about the campaign in Hamburg that happened in the summer of 1943. It was a series of raids on Hamburg, I think centered on the residential area to the north of Hamburg, that resulted in a vast firestorm that burnt for days, apparently 5 miles up in the sky, and an enormous and gruesome loss of civilian life, which he articulates in this essay in vivid detail. And here in Harburg, we're quite far away from the northern suburbs, but if there's a 5-mile high firestorm, then I imagine that might have been quite present. I don't actually know if Darboven, as a small child, lived here with her family, or if they had evacuated somewhere else. that's an open question that I'm curious about. But supposing that they're living here, I mean, those are terrifying circumstances for children, parents, you know, the entire neighborhood. In this essay that Sebald writes, which was quite controversial when it came out in 2002, he's talking about this as you know, basing this incident and describing the kind of conundrum of the inability of in post-war times of the German population to articulate or even recognize the trauma that came out of these events, and there was this kind of reflexive action of keeping quiet and looking the other way. So the family is living in the farmhouse. This house has been sold to the city, and in the post-war time it's used then as an orphanage, and kind of understandably in that period there were a lot of orphans, there were a lot of children who'd lost their parents. It belonged to the city, and you know, interesting to think of 100 children living here, separated with a wall from the house, but really it's a very close proximity. And what that environment might have been like for Darboven, who herself was a child. You know, she was only 9 or 10 in the early 1950s. The orphanage closed at some point, I think, in the 70s, and then later, I think in the post-reunification times, post-Cold War, it was used for refugees from Eastern Europe. You know, so as isolated and pastoral and bucolic as it feels here, there was also this other sense, you know, of people coming and going, of a different kind of population to, you know, comfortable families in large villas. So that's the background about the house. And now a little background about Hanne Darboven. Again, this is repeating what most of you, I'm sure, know already. She was born in 1941 to a Danish mother, Kirsten, and a German father, Cäsar Darboven. Hanne Darboven describes her father as an Unternehmer, Jäger and Sammler, a businessman, hunter and collector. This coffee roastery and colonial goods dealership had been in his family since 1866. His father took it over in 1895, and he was then the next generation. Darboven, Hanne was the second of 3 daughters, so, you know, for anybody, I'm a middle child. Anyone else who's a middle child will, you know, their ears will prick up when they hear that. But also, interestingly, there were 3 daughters. There was no male heir. I don't know if that means something or doesn't mean something, but it's interesting considering, you know, what happened to the family later. So she lived here with her 2 sisters, Großmutter and Kinderfrau. So it was an entirely female community, except for the patriarch, the Unternehmer, Sammler und Jäger. So there's a very interesting interview in this film by Walter Schmerling. He's invited to have for cafe by Kirsten and Hanne. He comes over to the house, and they're having a cafe and Kuchen, and he's talking to the mother about Hanne, and she's a feisty woman. She's pretty cool, I think. She says to him, Hanne hat zu viel Intelligenz gekriegt. She's over intelligent. Und dann ist es schwer zu wissen, was man macht. You know, what to do with a child who's over intelligent. For many mothers, this would be a real problem. But I think that this is, you know, so crucial for Hanne Darboven's life that for her mother, she didn't see it as a problem. She just tried to find a way for it to be channeled. And it was channeled into music and art. She studied music also to quite a high level, but then decided to pursue art. In 1962, she went to the Hochschule für Bildende Kunst in Hamburg. And, you know, these are all of the points that are always recited when talking about Hanne Darboven's biography, because there isn't really much that happened until she moved back to Hamburg. So in 1966, she went to New York. But interestingly, this is something that Esther Döring told us when we were on the tour. When she went to New York on a ship from Rotterdam, her mother drove her in the car to Rotterdam, in the trunk of the car was a huge crate full of her works the works that she considered to be successful works that she'd made in Hamburg at the Kunsthochschule. So she was really going to New York with a purpose, taking her works with her to show them to people, you know, to be able not just to be there as a person, but as a working artist. She lived on East 90th Street and First Avenue in a 30 square meter apartment that she rented for $250 a month. And while she was there, she met Sol LeWitt, Carl Andre, Joseph Kosuth, Robert Rauschenberg, Andy Warhol. So this entire cosmos of artists, and importantly, Leo Castelli, who also features in the film by Walter Schmerling. He was to show her work throughout her life. In this interview in the film, he says he sold nothing of her work. It took 20 years for people to understand it. You know, that's so interesting. You know, this like long-term belief in an artist is very inspiring. So she's in New York, surrounded by artists, making her work, making connections, committed to the idea of being an artist. In 1968, her father dies, and she comes back to Harburg. She moves back into the family home. But when she's asked about what she did when she was in New York, she says, gearbeitet. I just worked. Ich habe mich selbst gefunden. So she discovered herself, and it was this new self that came back to Harburg in 1968. So she returns to a family home without a patriarch. The only male inhabitant of the home is gone. And during this time, oops, I have to skip ahead. Yeah, during this time, the mother and daughter develop a symbiotic relationship. As I said, Hanne Darboven's mother was very sympathetic to her life as an artist. She supported her in this unconventional life choice and her radical art production. So that was one crucial benefit, I think, that enabled her to go as far as she went. The other important thing to remember is that they were financially independent. She didn't have to consider making a living. They were property owners. They had a bourgeois life that allowed for this opting out of you know, everyday economics. So what role does Darboven play in this setup? The patriarch is absent, the matriarch has free, but this is this cafe where the filmmaker Walter Schmerling is invited for coffee, where the mother is talking about her daughter. Yes, sorry, I'm going to skip back to this. Yes, so she is dutiful, but on the other hand, she assumes this unusual personal style. She's wearing these tailor-made suits. She has this radically short haircut. She's permanently smoking a cigarette. And just in this choice of dress, it suggests that she's taking on the role of being the man of the house. If we want to talk about it in these binary terms that are probably not necessarily useful. Anyway, so she chooses this out-of-time style. She made drawings of the clothing of what she was looking for. She took it to the local Harburg tailor, and he made her 3 suits, one for summer, one for autumn, one for winter, 6 blouses, all made out of a kind of pale blue jeans-like fabric, sometimes white, otherwise pale blue, a jacket and a coat. And that was her uniform. She said she wasn't interested in thinking about like what skirt length it was currently fashionable. She wanted something where she didn't have to think about it, she just knew what to wear every day. Plus, she assumed the role of the boss within this household. She was in charge of various staff and their production. Meanwhile, the domestic aspect was completely taken care of by her mother. So within the rest of the house itself, or for Darboven herself, she didn't have to worry about it. She didn't have to think about it. And as her work expanded to fill the house, the domestic side of things got smaller and smaller and smaller. The kitchen remained entirely her mother's realm. This is the kitchen. It stayed still like that now. I mean, this is probably from probably from the time when they moved in the 40s. I'm not sure about that, also to be checked. And the domestic role, was entirely performed by her mother. Here you can see on the table is the framed photograph in the kitchen of her mother, and that's a bad picture of this sweet framed photograph. So the kitchen remained in her mother's hands until Kirsty Darboven died in 1998. And throughout these 4 decades, 1969 to 2009, the house begins this kind of organic development, becoming less and less domestic, less and less recognizable as a home, and more something else, perhaps like an office to start with. And so this is the very kind of rudimentary sleeping quarters in the main house. And this again, I don't know if you can see it, such a bad picture, but it's a very sweet image of the mother and daughter. And so this is the, Darboven in her realm, the office stroke house. So this is the first thing I want to think about. This house as a workplace, what does that mean? So the house, it's not just one house, it's an ensemble of houses. The farmhouse that they lived in, but once she moved back, she already, I think more or less as soon as she moved back, she began building additions. There was one addition built in the late 1960s called the Schwitters house, where she would work on this particular black desk, and it will come up a little bit later. And then she built this other house called the Tower, which is the one with the green railing outside, which is, this one pictured here, which was finished in 1974 and pictured by Bernd and Hilla Becher in the top left there. And this house, the Tower, was actually built for her to be a self-contained living working space. There's a kitchen, there's a bedroom, there's a bathroom. She was going to move in there, but that did not last very long. And you can see what happened to the kitchen. It doesn't look like it was really used as a kitchen very much at all. And this is so interesting, this sofa like jammed up against the cupboards with that little sign on it that says bureau. That kind of says it all. And then the last building, which is this one out of the window here, was built as an archive house. Was not yet finished when Darboven died in 2009, but it was built to be used as storage for her work. So there's this shift happening from working at home to living in a studio, and this kind of unusual situation of basically inhabiting a space until it gets so full you can't move, and then you just build another one and then start from scratch. Like these waistcoats that are so appealing, where she would fill it all with buttons and then it would be finished. So the choice there is not to try and make space. You're not going to try and extract things, you're not going to reduce. It's never about reduction, it's always about accumulation. I don't think for the sake of it, but because that's what happens over time. It's realistic, it's realist, perhaps. So I want to think about this, the artist house as a place of work, and bring in the first comparative artist, which is Louise Bourgeois. Obviously a very different kind of work to Hanne Darboven's work. She's also a different generation, probably Hanne Darboven's mother's generation. She was born in 1911. And she famously lived in this brownstone on 20th Street in New York, where she'd moved in 1962 with her husband. By this time, her children, she had 3 children, 1 adopted, 3 boys, 3 children altogether. They were already grown up. They weren't living at home. In the previous house where she'd lived with her children when they were small, she'd worked on the roof, on one of these mansard roofs that they have in New York, and there she made these very tall wooden sculptures, a little bit like the skyline of New York. And it's from that time that these famous femme maison works come. She made these works in the mid-1940s when she was living with small children. And for anybody who knows what living with small children feels like as a mother, I think, doesn't need any explanation. So, but when she moved to West 20th Street in 1962, the children were out of the house, and she moved into the cellar. And here she began experimenting with latex, with plaster, with resin. And then when her husband died 10 years later, she expanded out of the cellar and basically took over the whole house. The whole house became a studio. It wasn't so much working from home as living in the studio, which is also the case with Darboven, I think. Also in Bourgeois' house, every surface of the house is crammed full with materials, tools, tapestry fabrics, books, paper. Every surface is full. Later in life, she was quite elderly, very elderly. She lived to be almost 100. She suffered from agoraphobia, and she was really, all of her production came from the kitchen table. So everything that she made in the last, 10 years or so of her life was made around this kitchen table. She didn't have a mother helping her, but she had this incredibly dedicated assistant, Jerry Gorovi, who basically was an enabler, did everything that she needed to be able to do to make the work she wanted to make. So this is, just a kind of comparison of an idea of what it's like to work from home, what kind of work can be done from home. Of course, with Bourgeois, it was a more physical kind of work. It was making sculpture, drawing, sewing. Yes, it's very sedentary. I can't read my writing without my glasses. Anyway, so it's also, in this last period of her life, very desk-bound, is a little similar to the kind of work that Hanne Darboven was doing in her house. Except for her, the tools were paper, pencil, pen, and this important stamp, this little wooden-handled stamp that occurred in many, many works. So in 1968, she already begins to work with numbers and dates as a point of departure. Miriam Schufs again describes her appreciation for the mercantile in her date calculations, list, registers, indices, and accounting ledgers. In 1969, she begins her first written works with the script, the wavy U forms, and now she calls herself a writer. In 1970, she begins her first handwritten transcriptions. She transcribes Homer's Odyssey by hand. And here the content is the medium of writing, beyond the narrative she's copying, and the time required for this act of manual transcription, which can obviously take months to produce. It's a process-based work in which the content is transformed into experience. And the medium is crucially not language. It's not about primarily the meaning of the words. The medium is writing, which she calls writing without describing. It retains the physicality of language, but it's drained of semantic sense. It's not completely drained of semantic sense because you can still read it, but there's this, and this is what was so interesting in with Paula's talk, that if you do go into it and read just one sentence, then it can open up a whole whole number of questions. But Hanne Darboven said herself, "My work is registration in the sense of being. It's a working through." So it's a kind of putting down of evidence of her own existence as a daily activity. So it's desk-based, administrative-like work. They're these kind of pseudo-bureaucratic activities that exhibit diligence, they're disciplined, it's a kind of fulfillment of duty and obligation. She would work through the night, she would go to bed in the small hours, but before going to bed she would write a little note for her mother of what needed to be done the next day. And then when she got up around lunchtime, she would have breakfast, and then she and her mother would drive around in the VW Cabrio that's parked in the carport in the garden, and do all of the tasks that had to be completed. And then the afternoon desk work would begin. So, again, she's taking the logic of working hours, the bureaucracy of institutions or businesses, but she's adapting it to entirely her own terms. These self-invented systems where the habits and actions are the same, but the consequences are radically different. It's this kind of ordnung ad infinitum for the sake of the procedure. So while the activity of writing takes place at a desk, the end result is not confined to the page. It's not printed, bound, and distributed as a book primarily, although this also happens, but primarily the writing on the page is spread out in space. Sie schreibt die Zimmer voll. Ich schreibe Räume voll. She creates an index of time through this medium of writing and then turns it into a three-dimensional, room-filling kind of work. And even in the house, you can see that these pages, these frame pages are installed on the walls, on the ceiling, as we can see here. Here is this work with this is about to run out of battery, this computer. Just noticed, might be important. What's that? It should last 10 more minutes or 15 more minutes. Is that all the time I've got left? Oops, I better speed up. Okay. All right, so yeah, this is this quartet with the important female cultural figures. And then we come to Schreibzeit in 1975. She's working in the tower, this building that was built as a home. And here, at this moment, she inaugurates her material collection. Schreibzeit, writing time, was completed over many months. She's working at this black table in the largest, tallest studio. It's I can't say a lot about this work, having not seen it in real life. You have to really see these works up close to understand them, to begin to understand them. But importantly, in this work, photographs of objects were incorporated for the first time. And these objects had to go somewhere. So these objects, they found their place in the house. And year by year, this collection of objects grew. She had a handful of local, loyal antique dealers who would find things for her or bring things to her that they thought might interest her. Apparently, she bought something every day. I mean, I think she was very popular amongst these antique dealers. She also bought things from local estate sales. So she kind of cultivated these people to know what she was looking for. And you can see this in the house, there's certain strands of interest. And these objects would then be photographed and the images of the objects incorporated into works, beginning with Schreibzeit. So this other layer of reference was added to the already material aspect of the written and numerical work, which Lawrence Wiener described. He really understood her work, I think, profoundly. He said it's about materialist culture. It's not interpretation, but presentation. So the things she shows stand for reality. He says you make your own metaphor for the work. And I think that that's something that really can be seen by all of the many different simultaneous interpretations that are possible. I mean, it can hold so much. So the house is the crucible for the work. It's here that it's produced. Hanne liked to be photographed at her desk in the role of the Unternehmerin, perhaps. So, but also essential to this constellation were the staff. She had a registrar, 2 transcribers, a printer, musicians and composers who worked on the musical aspect of her work, which I won't go into at all today. There was a house photographer and a house carpenter. So she herself is she's the general controller of this organism. She's the manager and the delegator. And once a year there would be parties held by her mother, organized by her mother, held by Hanne, with Sinti musicians from Hungary playing. And another important addition, which I skipped over before, is the goats. I don't know if you can see that in this. This is actually the advertisement for the first show that she did at the Kunstverein in Hamburg in 1983. And on the invitation, there are these pictures, snapshots of her with her goats. Many of you will know this already, but she loved goats. She always had a pet goat, and the goat was always called Mickey, and they lived just down behind the fence beside the new building here. The last one died in 2015, 6 years after she did.
Very political statement there.
I can't, what
In the green one. Schmidt hat eine Weideziege nicht gefressen, aber Kohl, so that is Helmut Schmidt and
Right.
Kohl. Aber Kohl frisst sie.
Exactly. So there's always, you see, I'm just focusing on the goats, but there's always these several layers in each page, in each detail of the work. It's really extraordinary. So moving ahead, the house is a workplace, but it's also a repository once these objects start to be included. These objects which are incorporated in her work. So the house itself becomes like this kind of backstage, or this fundus, you know, this kind of collection of these things, and which are partly extraordinary things, you know, unusual objects like animal sculptures and taxidermy, toys, religious props, figurines and mannequins, globes, model ships, antiques, musical instruments, knickknacks. But they're also very ordinary things, coffee cups. Obviously, there's a relation to coffee with her family. You know, but there's these, again, these simultaneous differentiated layers. So there is a lot of objects. It's difficult to orient yourself within them, but they're not random. Nothing is in there accidentally, I don't think. There's a system and a logic to everything. And like all collectors, in amongst all of these many buildings, Hanne Darboven knew exactly where everything was. She could lay her hands on a piece of paper the moment you asked for it, or a particular object. And if she couldn't find the kind of object she had in mind for her work, then she would ask her house carpenter to make it. So these are some pictures of the things that she did find. Musical instruments, also important. But this is a terrible snapshot with Esther Döring giving us the tour. This is something her house carpenter made for her, for instance, like an oversized sculpture of a horse. Or I believe also this angel that's hanging above the desk. There was also within this very many books, so there is in a sense a library, but the library is dispersed, like all of the objects are dispersed. The library is dispersed amongst all of these different buildings. It's when you think of a library, you think of shelves, rows, order. There is an order probably, but it's Hanne Darboven's order. And she would have also, her carpenter would make her these very representative kind of 19th century style glass fronted cabinets. So there's this interesting shift that occurs in the identity of the house. The house fills with objects, but as the house fills, the use value of these objects empties. And another parallel meaning is foregrounded, the meaning of the objects within Darboven's own semantic system. In 1978, in the work Bismarckzeit, she incorporates an object for the first time in its installation. Sorry about the really terrible image. And then in 1983, this kind of vital work called Kulturgeschichte is first shown. Okwi and Weisor called it the black box of Hanne Darboven's work, saying that it contains every facet of her thinking. It has over 30,000 postcards in it, depicting photographs of objects selected from the studio home, so from the artist's own private rooms, as well as being exhibited along with 19 found objects and artifacts. This is the sculpture that's also in Bismarckzeit. Again, I'm not going to go into what any of this is. that's like a whole other day's worth of symposium, probably. And then in this interesting work, Milieu, from 1980, she integrated small black and white photographs that actually show the objects in situ within the house. So it gives this kind of insight into the interior, the domestic interior, which isn't actually any more necessarily domestic. So there are these extractions going on. There's objects coming in, and then there's objects going out for exhibitions and returning. So it does have this kind of fundus-like quality of being like a repository. It's storage in a way, but it's then also a studio where objects are photographed. And this is maybe a little bit of a diversion, but this idea of the repository of all of these existing objects, these found objects, made me think about the work of Lutz Bacher, who is her contemporary, born in 1943 on the west coast of America. And Lutz Bacher is an artist who works exclusively with found objects or existing materials of different kinds, reconfiguring it in constellations that also evade the original use and meaning of these objects. Oh, something's happened here, sorry. Okay. I'm not going to go into this deeply for time, but her exhibitions are wildly divergent in material. She's essentially working as a sculptor. It's a different kind of work to Darboven's, which is more conceptual, of course. Bacher's exhibitions stage an encounter with material where wildly divergent objects are brought together. They may be familiar, but their meaning has been displaced and reconfigured and refuses to offer the viewer a stable footing. And I think in this, this idea of reconfiguring objects and suggesting another kind of semantic construction has interesting intersections with Darboven. So this constellation of objects and Burgberg, does it hold meaning as a collection in total? Or do these objects only have meaning when extracted from the repository, as Bacher does with her work, and placed on the stage of the artwork itself in an exhibition installation? And this brings me to the question of the Gesamtkunstwerk. So Orqui and Wieso, again, he says that the house is the work of an encyclopedic mind. Somebody has asked him, don't you find it strange, this house? Don't you think it's a little weird? And he says, no, it's not weird. It's the work of an encyclopedic mind. I don't consider it strange at all. It's full of discoveries. And I would second that. And again, Miriam Schufs, she says, in their totality, as material references to reality, the objects constitute a cultural history of things. And just from one single visit to the house, I think it's clear to see that there are, countless discoveries to be made there. There's unfathomable, there's an unfathomable source of research into deeper understanding Darboven's work. But thinking about the Gesamtkunstwerk, I want to bring in another artist comparison, and this is Kurt Schwitters, of course, born in 1887. And I want to think about particularly his great lost masterpiece, the Märzbau. So just to give you a little background, Schwitters began working in Hanover in Germany after the First World War, when there was this kind of colossal breakdown in the understanding of everyday experience as a result of the incredible losses and loss of life and damage that occurred in the first industrialized war that brought with it this sense of fragmentation. The Märzbau, this is what it looked in its final stages, but this was the site, this was where it was made. In Waldhausenstraße in Hanover, the house where Kurt Schwitters had grown up himself, moved there as a teenager with his parents. It was his parents' house. When he married in 1915, he married a cousin. They moved upstairs. So they're living upstairs in his parents' house, and in 1919, he has like one room which is his studio. It used to be his father's bedroom, and in here he's making his works. And the basis of this work is like collecting residues from the streets of Hanover, bringing them into the space, and then forming these connections between them. He's working with the material of everyday life in raw material in a very physical sense. And then he's making connections between these things. He's talking about realism, a realism made from real things, which I think is very close to the way that Darboven is working. So he's bringing these things in, he's working in his father's former bedroom, and he's making connections between these different objects, these different fragments, in this system that he calls März. He says März means to create relationships, ideally between all the things in the world. So in making these connections between these objects, he builds these towers. This is known as the first März column from 1923. It appeared in the corner of his studio. And then he's making connection between these different objects, initially with string, and then he would reinforce these string connections with like wooden lathes. And then these wooden lathes would be covered with plaster, so it becomes this kind of room-filling environment. And it essentially took over, started in his father's bedroom, his studio, but then it grew and took over many other different rooms of the build of the house and kind of pushed the everyday and family life to the periphery. And so through doing this, he circumvented the claustrophobic social environment of Hanover by building a fantasy house within this bourgeois home, a private autobiographical structure concealed within the publicly respectable family homestead. The Märzbau existed as a metastasizing organism within the ossified architecture of middle-class German life. And Schwitters fled to Norway in 1937. The house in Hanover was destroyed in other Allied bombing in 1943. But when he was in Norway, and then again later when he fled from Norway to England, and the Lake District where he spent the last years of his life, everywhere he went, he was attempting a recreation of the Märzbau. This was like his work, something that he always returned to. The system of it was the point. And I think it's interesting to think about Schwitters making this kind of work in the post-First World War era as a way of trying to, I wouldn't say come to terms with, but trying to understand what this fragmentation meant. And Darboven working in Germany in the post-Second World War period, and also, faced with the enormity that that suggests, inventing a system to hold it or react against it. I haven't figured out exactly what it's doing, but it's definitely doing something. She says, bei mir ist es kosmopolitisch global. Like Schwitters, hers is a system capable of absorbing everything. It's an atlas kind of situation. The objects are holders of meaning, but perhaps in the way that a musical instrument is a holder of music. They resonate once you understand, once you convince them to. They're not going to give you anything unless you give them your time. So if this is a Gesamtkunstwerk, which it may be, apropos, yes, so. If this is a Gesamtkunstwerk, then what are its boundaries and how can it be used or shown? One possibility is to remove aspects of it. This is the famous desk where she made Schreibzeit. You can see there's this, this raised up platform where she would open out her exercise book and perform her writing. And this in the retrospective that was held in 2016 at the Haus der Kunst in Munich and the Bundeskunsthalle Bonn. This was then extracted from the house and exhibited. The question is it an artwork? is, you know, what happens when you do that. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. It looks fantastic, and I think it's a great insight into her work, but it kind of is in this, hovers in this in-between space. The same with the music room from the house was also shown in that same exhibition. So it's an open question, you know, is it a Gesamtkunstwerk? What to do with it? Like, how does it have to stay together? Can you extract elements? The Hanne Darboven Foundation, which was set up in 2000, in the statutes it states that elements cannot be removed and that the works you know, have to be put back in the place that they're currently in. And as there are many original artworks also in the house, on the walls, on the ceiling, on the desks, everywhere. These have all been replaced by replicas, and the originals are now in storage. But I wonder if perhaps Darboven's whole life was the Gesamtkunstwerk, and the Burgberg was just the stage for it. And if that's the case, then is it only now that she's passed away that it's kind of final, that it's fossilized? I think you mentioned the word fossil. I think that's very interesting in relation to her work. You know, is this now a fossil of all these like sedimentary layers that she created during her lifetime? So time is clearly a central element of her work. I have two more short sections and then we're done. Is everybody still with me? Okay. If you start dropping off, then I'll speed up even more. You know, it's very, you can't be concise about Hanne Darboven's work, you know. It just doesn't allow it. Time is a central element, obviously. The day as a unit of time, the calendar as the expression of time, these particular K values that she's come up with, this kind of checksum of the digits of the day that she adds up in a particular way and calls K values. So this is perhaps one aspect of the Gesamtkunstwerk. And then so perhaps we can see the house as a diaristic entity. Within it, the passing of time is recorded or articulated through this accumulation of material objects. As it's manifest materially through her writing practice, it's also manifest through the kind of accumulation of things that just goes with an everyday life. It's very hard to resist that. So one important kind of very concise, you know, unusually concise way that this is expressed is in these Taschenkalender that she filled in from 1966 to 2009, these leather-bound pocket calendars. There's 44 of them in total, and inside them are just little notes concerning her everyday life. Sometimes they're more personal, sometimes they're just very pragmatic, dates of appointments, but every hour is accounted for. And again, these diaries are not ephemera. Like, these kind of things would be shown in, you know, other kinds of artists' exhibitions as ephemeral material. These are not ephemera. This is the work. You know, this is maybe the hardest core, the kernel of the work. It's primary artistic material. Another form is the Halbjahreskalender. These like pre-printed calendars, commercially available, very limited space. Here they're shown in the house itself. This is what they look like. But both because these, you know, not only because they're shown in the space now, but because they were filled in the space, these both kinds of calendars are intrinsically related to the place where they're filled in. This was the point of return. So what this kind of suggests is these two different time scales that are going on concurrently. And I think that this relates to the whole dilemma of interpreting Darboven's work, that there's the micro aspect of it, which is already rich, and then this huge macro aspect of it. Beneath the daily time scale is another larger, almost geological time scale that she's hinting at, which is suggested through these sedimentary accumulations of paper, of material, of objects. And what this suggests is that there is no division between the activities that constitute art and those that constitute an everyday life. The everyday has been absolutely subverted in the service of art. And this is just going to be a very brief aside, but this is also something that is very much the case in the work of Diether Roth, an everydayness that saw all work as a kind of diary and absolutely manifest the lack of division between the material of an art practice and the material of everyday life. So these are his diaries, which have also been exhibited. They have a very different haptic quality, of course. What's happening on the pages is something else, but the ground, the basic concept about it is interestingly related to Darboven, I think. They're a little closer in generation. He was born in 1930 and died in 1988. I think there's a lot more to be explored, and perhaps there's people who have already been exploring it that I haven't come across. I'm sure there are, in fact. The intersections or the kind of commonalities between the work of Diether Roth and Hanne Darboven. So this is where I want to conclude, which is this idea of the house as an anchor. Hanne Darboven says, bei mir ist es kosmopolitisch global. So within the enormity of that statement, which I believe is true, I think her work is cosmopolitisch global, the house exists as a still point. It implies a physical stasis and isolation which is set against this continuous temporal flow that's recorded in her works, which do function largely like calendars and mark the passing of time. And in this, I also think that she's remarkably prophetic. If you think about the fact that she died in 2009 and there's something about the understanding she had of a network that has become so manifest and visible in the interim between 2009, where the iPhone had only been available for 2 years, and now, it's like she prophesied this incredible connectivity and the sense of the overwhelmingness of information politics, the cosmopolitisch global, in fact, which is what we're living in now, I would say, our everyday lives. So within that, am Burgberg here becomes this kind of anchor. And she designated it Ubiquist, designed these particular postcards and incorporated them in. They come up in various different works. Again, my understanding of this is absolutely rudimentary, but I do know that this is a reference to the place, to this anchor. Here also in the courtyard, you can see this, the Stempel, the stamp that she had made has been built into the floor, which I love that detail. I think it's so fun. Just the idea to do that, I think is so fascinating. And meanwhile, inside the house, there are these portraits of herself all over the walls, which suggests this self-reflexivity, this like mirroring aspect that's also happening. So I wonder, given this, if it's an anchor, if it's a way of providing a counterbalance to the flow of time, then what happens now when essentially the flow of time in Hanne Darboven's life has come to an end? Like, is it a mountain? Is it like a fossil? Has it become this kind of stable geological form now that objects are no longer moving in and out? It's frozen in time. And if it is frozen in time, then how do we handle it? What are we to do with it? With that comes a question of preservation, which is is a vital question and very difficult. I just want to bring in one more comparison very briefly. This is a Polish artist, Edward Krasiński. I don't know if anyone has come across him. He lived in Warsaw on the 11th floor of a communist-era apartment block. He was born 1925. 2005, died 2004. After he died, this very question has been very pertinent, what to do with this space that he left, which was a Gesamtkunstwerk. That is full of these like little arrangements of objects, these kind of surrealist, conceptualist arrangements of objects. And the most signature aspect is this line of blue tape that goes all the way around the perimeter of everything in the apartment. And with the passage of time, of course, something like this happens. You know, the tape's not sticking to the wall anymore. We're like, what to do about dust? Like, what to do about dust in Hanne Darboven's house? I mean, that, you know, is a question. So how to keep it in this static state? How to hold off the detrimental effects of time, but nevertheless keep it lively? What happens when the artist is no longer here? I have this note here. What happens when the artist is no longer here to animate and explicate the complex, overlapping, self-invented systems that it contains? But of course she didn't. She didn't articulate and explicate them. She put it there, and she left it for us to articulate and explicate. So it needs custodians and interpreters and experts to keep it alive. But on the other hand, the house itself is full of discoveries. It can cultivate custodians and experts and interpreters. Like, that's what it's doing every day, you know, just by being here. So it's also perhaps subversive as a kind of inheritance. You know, it's this very kind of cumbersome, difficult, like what to do with the inheritance. These kind of heirlooms that, you know, they're not useful. But nevertheless, it's worth preserving. So that's the end, but I also want to kind of loop back to the beginning when thinking about Darboven's childhood during the war as an underpinning of her sensibility, of her deeply political understanding of the world. So, yes, meine asketische Zahlenkonstruktionen und meine musikalische Produktion ist für jede Politik unbrauchbar. Like, that is the fundamental, most important aspect of her work. It cannot be instrumentalized by any political organization. Like, if you think about that in relation to the Second World War and the way that bureaucratic mechanisms were abused, it's a super political approach to an artistic practice and life. Geschichte wiederholt sich nicht, aber sie ist nicht nachvollziehbar, ohne das Vergleiche. Eine Variante in der Wiederholung gibt es schon. Krieg ist immer Krieg. Die Ursache und die Tatsache bleibt den Krieg. And that, with that thought, which I think obviously today is very relevant, I'd like to end it. And with this I'm sorry that was so long. If anybody has any questions, I might not be able to answer them, but I'll try. Oh, good. Thank you.
I think we should still take a moment to open the floor for some questions. If there's anyone in the room that would like to ask a question, now is the opportunity.
I've overwhelmed everybody. I battered you into submission.
Thank you for this really wonderful talk. I'm concerned with the work of Hanne Darboven, but for the first time I was intrigued by the idea that a lot of the Kinder dieser Welt and the child toys in the house might be influenced by exactly living together with these children's home, the orphanage with 100 children. next to it and seeing also the poverty, right? As I've said, 100 people,
Yes.
2 adults keeping them.
Yes, exactly. And here there's the Großmutter Kinderfrau.
I'm not, but Elke, has that been discovered before, or has there been work on it, on this relationship between living so close? Also, next time with the immigrants, I think it started already in the 80s. People coming from Russia, from the different culture, and her political, because I think she was political, because if you see also the Oppo saying that a bad peace is always better than a good war.
Yes.
And the relations between the openness and the East politics of the Social Democrats at that time, perhaps it has all a bit together, seeing that as a neighbor, people fleeing from the East and trying to live it up. So
There is no research, I don't know something.
yeah, me neither. So that was a good,
I mean, it's
a
a
fantastic
many
starting
of
point for new research
many of
going
these,
into that.
You know, this opportunity brought up a lot of questions. Like in the research, it brought up more questions than answers, I would say, which is you know, always exciting. But yeah, I don't know what that. But it is interesting to think about. She was living across the wall with mother, father, Großmutter, Kinderfrau, 2 sisters, 3 children, and on this side, it's 2 adults and 100 kids. You know. Yeah, speculative.
Are there any further questions? I just like to make a comment. I really appreciated the approach of a symmetrical relationship between the environment and the artistic practice. That was really beautiful how you portrayed this, that the environment sort of creates the artist, but the artist creates the environment. That felt really touching to me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.
Then maybe we do 10 minutes of a coffee break and then we move on with Elke Bippus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.